It is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Stephen A. Beebe. Now, I might as well start out by mentioning that, quite fittingly for this conference, he found an undiscovered Lewis manuscript, the beginning of a project called Language and Human Nature, which was to be co-authored by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah, that is pretty cool. But let's not short sell the rest of his career. He has co-authored 14 books, including C.S. Lewis and the Craft of Communication, that resulted in him being named Scholar of the Year by the Religious Communication Association. He served as Regents and University Distinguished Professor of Communication Studies at Texas State University, not to mention he's been president of the National Communication Association. He was also a visiting scholar at both Oxford and Cambridge universities, and he's received more awards than I can mention in the short time given to me. Needless to say, it is an honor to hear from him today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beebe.
Good morning. It is so good to be among friends. And I mean the word friends in the broadest possible way. Your presence here this morning really makes the prime point I want to bring to you today. My prime point is that C.S. Lewis was an expert communicator. The fact that you're here suggests that C.S. Lewis has communicated with you. And not only for probably most of us here, not only has he just communicated with you or you've connected with him, many of you have devoted many hours of study to Lewis. Some of Lewis's words written 60, 70 years ago. Today, for example, is the 70th anniversary of the publication of A Horse and His Boy, but you probably already knew that. I'm fairly new to Lewis studies, actually. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I first read any of Lewis. How many of you, I guess lots of you here, how many have read Lewis as a child, read the Narnia books? I wouldn't have been able to raise my hand because I didn't. It wasn't until I made sort of a serendipitous visit to Oxford in 1990. My wife Sue and I, were in England, and we booked some day trips out of London, and one was to Stratford, one was to Warwick, and on the way back they stopped for about 90 minutes in Oxford. But I remember getting off the bus and saying, what is this place? How many have been to Oxford? You know. What is this place? I didn't want to get back on the bus. And I remember as I did get back on the bus, it's sort of like, as God is my witness, I will find a way to come back here. And I did. I applied for a sabbatical at Texas State University. They typically didn't give sabbaticals to department chairs. I asked for one. They sort of blinked and said, okay. And I had a sabbatical at Oxford in 1993. And my family and I, my wife Sue and my two sons who are in middle school, Mark and Matthew, we had a family adventure. We took them out of school and spent a term at Oxford. We were enamored, as many of you are, by the architecture, by the beauty of the place. We loved taking walks on Port Meadow. We lived not too far in the Jericho area in Port Meadow, and enjoyed just exploring. I took this picture just a few weeks ago when I was in Oxford, and I get to Oxford every year if I can. In fact, I'm going to go back in just a few more weeks. I love Oxford. But while we were in Oxford, I said, I think C.S. Lewis lived here, had some connection with Oxford. And I'd heard of C.S. Lewis. I heard he's the third most quoted person on Sunday morning. Jesus is first, Paul is second, and C.S. Lewis. So I'd certainly heard of C.S. Lewis, so I thought, well, let me see what I can find out about him. And a new book had just been published in paperback. Don't gasp. This was the book by A.N. Wilson that introduced me to C.S. Lewis. When I read it, what interested me about Lewis was Lewis. What a brilliant, eccentric interesting person, and I hadn't read a word of Lewis at all. So I thought, well, I should perhaps read some more of Lewis. So, in fact, my family and I, they were filming the movie Shadowlands when we were there in 1993. And so when we saw the movie, when we got back, I didn't understand the allusions to the wardrobe because I'd not read it yet. So I got busy and I started reading Lewis. I think the first book I read was Mere Christianity, and then I did read The Lion, the Witch, in the Wardrobe. There was a study group in Austin, the Austin C.S. Lewis Society, and Joel Heck, who many of you know, and George Masaccio were members of that group, and they were so very kind and patient with me as a new student of Lewis. But I'd read Lewis, and as a professor of communication, I'd say, hey, look at this. Here's Lewis talking about communication. Yeah, fine, Steve. Yeah, thanks. Very good. And but every week I would just see these applications to Lewis and communication. I thought, well, maybe that's something I can do, is look at that. I had a second sabbatical in 2002, and my project was going to be to look at Lewis manuscripts and to see what could I find about the way he communicated, about his the Roman canon of invention. How did he think? So I was going to look for, what did he edit out? What did he edit? But as I spent some time in the reading room, I was disappointed to find he didn't cross out a lot. At least the manuscripts there, a lot of them were fair copies. Some of his first drafts he threw away, but some of those, so I had to abandon that project because it was just, I wasn't going to find much by looking at that. So I just started checking out random manuscripts. And one day I checked out a manuscript just described as a notebook with odds and ends of things. And up in the corner, C.S. Lewis wrote the word scraps. So it was just sort of odds and ends of things. But if you turn the notebook over and read it back to front, I found these words. In a book like this, it might be expected that we should begin with the origins of language and proceed thence through prehistoric language till we come. This was a book about language. Well, I thought, surely it's been published, and so I went to see if I could find it, and I was very disappointed that I couldn't find it, because that meant I'd have to read. I didn't have Charlie Starr there to help me with the handwriting, so I'd have to read the handwriting. It took me 3 years going back and forth to Oxford, because as you know, you can't check anything out of Oxford. I didn't yet have permission to take any pictures of the manuscript, so I dutifully went to try to figure it out. I even started teaching a course about Lewis and communication, and part of it because this manuscript was about language and communication, but I really didn't know what it was until one day Sue said, our washing machine is broken, we have to go to the laundry. Okay. And so we went to the San Marcos laundry basket, and before I left the house, I just grabbed a book. Well, I need something to read. So I read The Company They Keep, which I'd read before, but I wanted to read it again. It's one of those books worth reading and rereading. But when I got to page 146, I'll remember that page number, Diana. When I got to page 146, Dinah was talking about a book that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had planned to write together called Language and Human Nature. Most folks thought, well, it was never written. They couldn't really find it. It was advertised to be published in 1949. Lewis and Tolkien both wrote about it in their correspondence, so apparently it existed, but we didn't know where it was until I was sitting there watching my clothes tumble in the laundry, reading that passage, and I remember sort of stopping and shouting at the top of my voice, I know what it is! Sue looked at me and said, what are you talking about, Steve? I think I know what that manuscript is. And sure enough, I went home and I found things in the manuscript I'd overlooked. The manuscript talks about your authors believe. Language and Human Nature, a book about communication. And that continued my reading and my study of Lewis and communication. Well, why focus on Lewis and communication? Well, 3 reasons. A couple of them I don't think I need to spend much time on that you would agree with. One reason is because C.S. Lewis was a popular communicator. You know that. Many of you teach that. His books, how many in print? One source said over 200 million books in print. So not only us, others have found a way to connect to the writing of C.S. Lewis. And some of his books are just life-changing. I was talking to John Fennell, and he teaches a course on Lewis and the abolition of man that's been highly praised. This is a copy of The Abolition of Man that Lewis sent to Mrs. Gribble, that he signed and sent this card. Dear Mrs. Gribble, here I am back at my desk again, and Somerset seems already a woeful way off. Thank you both again and again for giving me such a very nice time and sending me back full of country nights and fresh air and fresh eggs, writes C.S. Lewis. Yes, some people find his words so important, we want to touch his work. We want to collect it. We want to be near him because of how he is connected with us. Probably the most popular book, rated as the number one book of the 20th, the number one book based on Christianity Today survey. You know what book I'm going to mention? Mere Christianity. That people thought of all the books written about Christianity of the 20th century, this they listed as the number one book. What I argue is that C.S. Lewis knew something about communication. He knew how to connect with people. And in multiple languages, he's been published in, one report said, 47 different languages. Here's a first edition of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in Danish. And again, some people even want to collect those because of their interest in Lewis. Lewis was a popular communicator. And that's one piece of evidence that I offer. Why should we talk about Lewis and communication? A second reason is because he was a professional communicator. That's what he did for a living. What C.S. Lewis did for a living was he wrote things, he taught, and he gave lectures. My friend Jerry Root and his co-author Mark Neal identified 17 different literary genres in which Lewis taught. They said, here's their list. Lewis wrote about apologetics, autobiography, educational philosophy, essay, children's stories, journals, letters, literary criticisms, literary history, lyric poetry, narrative poetry, novels, religious devotion, satire, science fiction, short stories, and several translations. C.S. Lewis was a professional communicator. That's how he earned his living. That's what he did. But the third reason may be a bit more controversial, because what I'm going to suggest today is that C.S. Lewis was also a professor of communication. What I found as I read Lewis, maybe some of you have too, that it wasn't just in one source, but throughout his work, there were references to communication. It was Owen Barfield. Many of you know this quotation. Somehow what Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything. Well, what I found was in almost everything he wrote, there were references to language and communication. Sometimes he even referred to himself that way. In one letter, he said, I'm also an Irishman and a congenital rhetorician, he said. When I talk about communication, my own definition is how we make sense out of the world and share that sense with others. That's what communication is. And what I suggest is that C.S. Lewis made sense out of the world, and he shared his sense with us, and we want to read that. C.S. Lewis, I suggest, was a meta-communicator. He communicated about communication. He told us what he did. And he actually wrote several articles and books about communication. Look at that list of what C.S., the language of religion, before we can communicate, transposition, the slip of the tongue, the death of words, studies in words, language and human nature. Lewis, I suggest, was a professor of communication. It's something that he embedded in everything he taught. He loved language. He loved language. I was reading one manuscript, the language of religion, Robert Caro, who does research on Lyndon Johnson, who graduated from Texas State University, my university, but Robert Caro's advice to us who do research, he says, turn every page when you're in an archive. Turn every page as you're looking. Well, I was reading The Language of Religion, and when I got to the section on Lewis talking about poetic language, I turned the page, and there on the back of the page, Lewis had written a poem. And I thought, well, surely this was published, and I transcribed it, and that evening I went and emailed Don King. And I said, Don, here's something I found today. What can you tell me about that? And Don said, I've never seen that before. And I asked Walter Hooper about it too. The reason I was interested in it is because it suggests Lewis's playful use of language. This is a poem where he writes about what happens to certain words if we take the prefix dis and un off of them. Here's the poem. Dear me, how different you are, Penelope, from Grandmamma. Words with the prefix dis or un alone describe the course you run, while Grandmamma from early youth was cheveled, gainly, kempt, and couth. No sudden crisis ever caught her otherwise than turd and trot. She suffered fools with modest deign and sent them gruntled home again. And then, however long they'd stayed, some paraging remarks she made, nay, even for prettiest female friends, foretold and wished more astrous ends. If you, dear pen, prove such as she, oh, how appointed I shall be. Lewis loved language. He loved words. He loved the sound of words. And I thought that was worth studying. So that was my entree into Lewis, that he was popular, a professional, and a professor of communication. But primarily what I want to talk about is, what did C.S. Lewis say about communication? What does he have to teach us? I want to know, what did he have to teach me? I've been teaching a course on C.S. Lewis and communication for about 20 years. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. We want to make sure we're communicating. For about 20 years, the first day of class, at the last page of the syllabus, I give my students the final exam for the course. And the final exam consists of 2 questions, because I don't want my course to be guess what I think is important and see if you can figure that out. So the very first day of class, here's what I tell them. What I want you to be looking for is, what did C.S. Lewis say about communication? And then, what are Lewis's communication strategies? In essence, I wanted my students to have the same experience I did, because that's what I have been doing and continue to do as I look and try to mine Lewis's works for what did he say about communication. So I spent about 15 years looking at Lewis, and what I did, anytime I found Lewis saying anything about communication, I just simply typed it up and put it in a file, didn't worry about it. And it was after I sort of figured out what language and human nature was, I thought, well, let me see what I have here. And what I identified and will share with you today are what I call 5 baskets of ideas, or 5 principles of Lewis's communication. Let me be clear. Lewis never said, these are my 5 principles of communication. But as I looked at what he wrote, here are 5 ideas of what I think he should do. In addition to that, so many of you in this room have been helpful. Gary Tandy, Greg Anderson, Diana, Andrew Lazo, Bruce Johnson, as I read not only Lewis, but read your work to help me figure out what is it Lewis had to say about communication. And I identified 5 things. And in essence, when I wrote my book, C.S. Lewis and the Craft of Communication, I decided it was time I should take my own final exam. And so that's in essence what my book is taking my final exam, in which I talk about these 5 principles. I suggest Lewis was holistic, intentional, transpositional, evocative, and audience-centered. I'll talk more about those. If you didn't get those written down, I'm going to come back to them throughout this presentation. I needed something to help me remember those. I'm an absent-minded professor. And so for me, the acronym, I realized they formed the acronym HIT, Holistic, Intentional, Transpositional, Evocative, and Audience-Centered. So this morning, I invite you to have high tea with me and C.S. Lewis. Principle 1, I suggest that effective communicators are holistic. By that I mean integrated. And C.S. Lewis wrote about the importance of being holistic. I'll develop 3 subpoints under this principle. First, I suggest he combines speaking and writing, and many of you have talked about that in your own work, that Lewis was interested in speaking and writing. When I go to Oxford these days, I miss my friend Walter Hooper. I know many of you do too. Many of you were friends with Walter. Walter helped me realize that Lewis said when I use speaker throughout to cover writer as well. Walter, as you know, who served as secretary to Lewis for a short period of time and worked with Lewis's works. But I think Walter wanted to impress this upon me because almost every time I had tea or lunch or a drink with Walter, he would tell me what he also wrote at the beginning of collected letters. He'd say, when Lewis dictated his letters to me, he always had me read them aloud afterwards. He told me that in writing letters, as well as books, he always whispered the words aloud. Pausing to dip the pen in an inkwell provided exactly the rhythm needed. It's important to please the ear as it is the eye. That's one of the characteristics that I think makes C.S. Lewis Lewis, and maybe one of the reasons why we're here today, because Lewis's conversational tone connects with us. When a schoolgirl asked him for some techniques about writing, Lewis said, always write and read with the ear, not the eye. You should hear every sentence you write as if it were being read or spoken. If it doesn't sound nice, try again, said C.S. Lewis. So Lewis has that conversational quality that I think makes him attractive. A second holistic contribution I want to suggest, and others have too. This is not something that I'm identifying as original, but is the combination of reason and imagination. It was Clyde Kilby who said about Lewis, on the one hand, he has a deep and vivid imagination, and on the other, a profoundly analytical mind. Chad Walsh, one of the first to study Lewis, said basically the same thing. 2 strands run through Lewis's books are logic and romance, that reason and imagination. So looking at Lewis, you can find those 2 strands within him. I wanted to see if I could look along Lewis to find the same kinds of principles. One of my former students, Luke Dye, who also happens to be my nephew, is finishing his doctorate at Cornell University right now. And one of Luke's methodologies is to study big data. And so what we did was we put in 39 of Lewis's books into a big data program. And what we asked the program to do was look for what we defined as reason language, and we gave it some exemplars, and look for imaginative language. Could you find those? Did you see those? Yes. We, from Spirits in Bondage to Letters to Malcolm, sure enough, there throughout everything he wrote, the computer said yes and gave us a general percentage of those items. What we also found is that Lewis's use of imaginative language was quite consistent. It didn't vary much. It had a pretty good, significant chunk of imaginative language. We also found that the reason language had greater variability. About every 5 or 6 years, Lewis wrote a book, and there was a spike in the chart of reason language. Personal Heresy, for example, that's one I remember that had an extra dollop of reason language. And so we were looking at, did we find much different through Lewis's life? And so that we asked the program to look at the trajectory of Lewis's writing. The other thing we wanted to know, does it help us understand why some of Lewis's works are so popular? We found that it did help us understand that. what we found is that Lewis's most popular books, Mere Christianity, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Screwtape Letters, had the most balance. That's where he was most in balance with his reason language and imaginative language. So I suggest that one of the reasons Lewis is popular is because of his ability to do that. And his books remain popular. You've seen in the exhibit first editions of Screwtape Letters. That was one of his most imaginative. Here's a copy of Screwtape Letters. First printing is valuable because they only printed a couple thousand copies because they didn't think it would sell well. It had already been serialized, so that not many people will buy it or be interested in it. So a first edition of Screwtape Letters is particularly interesting and valuable. This is a publisher's proof of Screwtape Letters. This is a pre-first edition, the kind that editors and authors look at to make sure it looks okay on the page. So a pre-first edition of Screwtape Letters. Again, no. Thank you. But some of us find Lewis's work that we want to be near it. We want to, as did the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Francis Fisher. This is his copy, his first edition copy of Screwtape Letters. Lewis's use of reason and imagination works. We want to connect to it. Finally, the third area of combining this holistic approach is Lewis, I believe, integrated rhetoric, dialectic, and the poetic. Now, I know that sounds kind of academic, but hang in there with me in terms of, let me talk about those. Rhetoric is discovering the available means of persuasion. So rhetoric is about persuasion. Dialectic, Lewis defined in The Discarded Image as the art of disputation. And poetic is imaginative use of language. Lewis said, by poetry I mean, as the Renaissance critics meant, imaginative literature, whether prose or verse. What I think is interesting about that is that often in our universities, we teach those in separate departments and we have separate specializations. For example, when I went online to look at the curriculum at George Fox University, I found they have a wonderful debate team in one area of the university. Their communication department has an excellent discussion of rhetoric. Yet there's a fine program, as there are in many universities, that included the study of literature and poetry. For Lewis, they weren't compartmentalized. One of the things that gave him power and adds to his interest is that he combined those. The first time Aristotle's rhetoric was published in an English-speaking country was published in 1619. Until then, most of the publication was done in Venice in Europe. But about the early 1600s, publishing moved to London. But I think what is interesting in that book is that it included Aristotle's rhetoric under the same cover, Aristotle's Poetics. Here's that book, published in 1619 in the original binding. Now, I can't read it because it's in Latin and Greek. So probably my guess is this was designed as a textbook for Oxford or Cambridge or Durham or someplace like that. But isn't it interesting that when these ideas were introduced, they were introduced together as they were in Lewis's integration of them. Lewis, of course, he really wanted to be a poet. And so his first book, Spirits in Bondage, didn't sell very well. It wasn't very popular. In fact, in collecting Lewis first editions, it's the rarest book to find because not only didn't sell well, but those few that were left were destroyed. How many here have seen a first edition copy of Spirits in Bondage? How many have seen? A few of you have, but most of you haven't. Now you all have. And what I like about this particular book is that it was signed by C.S. Lewis. He said, from the author with many thanks, C.S. Lewis, as if to say, I'm Clive Hamilton, just in case you wanted to know. Dahmer was his second effort in 1926. It, too, is fairly rare because it did not sell very well. I have a letter that Lewis wrote back to the publisher where the publisher said, I have about 200 extra copies here. Mr. Lewis, would you like to have them? And Lewis says, no, I don't have any use for them. Just get rid of them. Here's a first edition copy of Dahmer. Rarer still is American first edition, but has this wonderful illustration on it. I was fortunate to be in Blackwell's at the right time, at the right moment, and hanging on my wall is the original cover art for Dahmer, because I think it's quite beautiful. And this particular first edition copy has been signed by C.S. Lewis. Lewis wanted to be a poet. He didn't make much money. He didn't have a bad contract. His contract for Dahmer, he was supposed to get 10% for the first 1,000 books sold. I don't think he sold 1,000 books. The reason I know that is because here's his contract. This is the original contract that C.S. Lewis signed for Dahmer. Here's the original contract for Pilgrim's Regress. They were a little bit more optimistic. He was going to get 10% for the first 1,000 sold. He was going to get 15 for the next 1,500 sold. He was going to get 12.5%. Interesting, and this was unheard of, is that if it was printed in America, get a load of this, authors, he was going to get 90%. 90% of the royalties, says his contract that he signed. So when I found a first edition, thank you, Andrew, of Pilgrim's Regress, it's nice to know that Lewis made some money off of this, but not much of the others. We want to connect with Lewis because he was holistic. Well, how did he do that? What can we learn from that? How can we be holistic like C.S. Lewis? Neurologists used to talk about right brain and left brain. Those are now more metaphors than anything. We know that, but there are language portions of the way we think and beauty and words and image portions of our brain. What we find when those two are combined, they are the best. When you communicate holistically. Kingsley Amis was a student at Oxford when Lewis was there, and he used to write about, he and his colleagues would categorize the lecturers at Oxford from hard to soft. Not in terms of intellectual difficulty, but a hard lecturer was one that gave you too much information, was too left brain, was too much data and information. He said, hard men gave you information while soft ones offered civilized discourse. He said, among the hardest was J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, he used the word, he said, he's almost repulsive. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he had too much to say. The golden mean lecturer. Here's the journal when that appeared. Here's the manuscript that Kingsley Amis typed and corrected, along with a little letter that he sent to Brian Aldous saying, have any corrections to this? Aldous didn't. I was at a reception in Oxford a few years ago. Sue and I didn't really know anyone, and we felt a little awkward, and there was this one distinguished gentleman there, and so we started chatting him up, and he said, I'd lived in Oxford all my life. And I thought, well, maybe he met Lewis. So I asked him, I said, did you ever meet C.S. Lewis? And he said, he was one of my best friends. It was Brian Aldiss, but I was chatting up. Lewis knew how to communicate holistically. In communication, we call it the 70-30 principle. In presentations, about 70% of what you say should be the illustration. About 30% should be the points that you're making. If all you're doing is making points, that wouldn't be very interesting. Or if all you're doing is telling stories and anecdotes, that would be like Lord David Cecil. Pleasant, but what do I have? So in terms of how to be holistic, and that was one of the things I'm interested in studying and teaching to my students as well. Principle 2, effective communicators are intentional. They're purposeful. Lewis's summary of that is simply think before you write. Think before you speak. He said, the first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, what it was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used. Have a goal in mind. Know the function. I thought it was interesting in the manuscript Scraps, Language and Human Nature, it offers one of the most comprehensive definitions of language and meaning that I've seen in any of Lewis's works. And his definition of language says language is intended to be signs by the person who makes them. Sometimes in communication, us communication professors get a good discussion going. One of our epithets that we propose is, you cannot not communicate. Then we ask our students, can you think of a time when you're not communicating? Can you think of a time when you're not communicating? I heard someone say when you're asleep, if you fell asleep this morning, you'd communicate something to me. The corollary principle is people judge you by your behavior, not your intent. But Lewis said when it comes to communication, start with an intent. Have a goal in mind. I originally wanted to know about Lewis's editing, so I've done some research on Lewis as an editor. The manuscript that was on his desk when Lewis died in 1963 was Letters to Malcolm. He hadn't had a chance to throw it away yet, so that's why I thought it would be interesting to see what I could learn about that. And so I found that what he did was he added 602 words. As I went back and looked at what did he add. However, he cut about 6 times that many. And that's classic Lewis. Brevity, clarity. In the last issue of 7, my friend Joel Hecht and I tell the story of this particular publication that I didn't really know about. Some of you probably did, but I didn't. Lewis served as a general editor of Nelson's Medieval and Renaissance Library. Jeffrey Shepard and some of his colleagues got an idea for this little series of really textbooks on medieval and Renaissance literature, but they realized they probably needed a bigger name than them to help sell it. And so that's when they asked C.S. Lewis. Derek Brewer, also one of the editors, knew Lewis and approached him. In looking at Lewis's edits, in the archive of letters that I have of correspondence, here's a fairly detailed letter that's 4 pages long of Lewis's edits and suggestions. And what I found was that to be a good editor, there it is again, to be clear. Here's what Lewis said to one of the authors. It is perhaps almost an advantage that I came to your introduction knowing almost nothing about this text. This enabled me to gauge how clear you were making things, for of course all expositions seem easy if we start by knowing what is expounded. So clarity and learning, and he sort of liked looking at something that he didn't know to see if it could make sense to him. Another of his hallmark kind of comments they would made is about brevity. Not surprisingly, in one comment in this letter, he says, I go through saving a sentence, even a word here and there. I found it's wonderful how many words one can say the way. And then he says, what a critique this is on my own style, exclamation point. But of course, there's a great danger in obscurity, as Horace taught us. So brevity was one of his hallmarks that I think focused on his goal being intentional and clear. A third area was keep your readers in mind as you're writing. He wrote this to one author. This is not at all easy to follow. I think this whole bit should be rewritten with the needs of the reader, starting from scratch, in my view. How do you be intentional? What lessons can we learn from that? Well, to make sure you know where you're going. Lewis always knew where he was going. Sometimes he didn't tell us where he was going. Sometimes he knew the atmosphere he was creating, but he didn't want to tip his hand to that, but some clever researchers have discovered that we're grateful for. Have an objective, and the technique there is when you have an objective, don't think about it as what you're going to do. Think about what you want the audience to do. For example, my objective today is at the end of this talk, you should be able to describe high tea. That's what I want you to do in that process. Clarity, again, is a hallmark. Walter said, what Lewis is so good at is taking extremely profound thought and putting them in everyday language that anybody can understand. And Lewis told us how to do that. He wrote about clarity. In God in the Dock, he said, the way for a person to develop a style is to know exactly what he wants to say and then be sure he's saying exactly that. Then he adds a right brain comment. Sometimes I think writing is like driving sheep down a road. If there's any gate open to the left or the right, the readers will most certainly go into it. Vintage Lewis. Vintage that also reflect his holistic brilliance as well. That's what makes that so memorable. C.S. Lewis was holistic. He was transpositional, is the third point that I want to make. C.S. Lewis was transpositional. Now, when I first started organizing my principles and ideas, I had a T for this principle, this basket of ideas, but it wasn't transposition. The first label I had for it was translation. What I realized that translation, that Lewis explicitly talked about several places, I call it a prelude to transposition. He explicitly said in his response to Dr. Pittenger, my task is simply that of a translator, one turning Christian doctrine into the vernacular, into language that unscholarly people would attend to and understand. He says, I've come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. His sermon Transposition, in which he talked about that, the process of transposition, Lewis doesn't really define it, but he gives characteristics of it. So this is my summary of what I think what Lewis was talking about. Transposition, as I'm using the term, and as I think Lewis used the term, is the process of communicating a spiritual or higher, sensual or richer, emotional experience, often using metaphor, to help others discover the meaning of the experience. And the reason we need transposition and not just translation is because sometimes our words are inadequate. In several places, Lewis says, we just don't have the right words. He wrote, one can't put these experiences into words, though all writing is a continual attempt to do so. Indeed, in a sense, one can hardly put anything into words. Only the simplest colors have names, and hardly any of the smells. The simple physical pains and still more the pleasures can't be expressed in language. Again, Lewis was interested in transposition. He gave a sermon about that. He thought his sermon was so important that when it was published for the first time, it was the lead essay. It was more important than the weight of glory that was later in the book, because he thought transposition is really a big idea. In talking about what transposition is, he said it's about going higher to lower, richer to poorer. And here he describes what he means by that. Our emotion life is higher than the life of our sensations, not morally higher, but richer, more varied, more subtle. The senses compensate for this by using the same sensation to express more than one emotion. I think really what he was talking about is how do we make the ineffable effable? What I propose that one of the reasons we're in this room and others read Lewis is because Lewis knows how to do that. He knows how to take experience. How do you communicate the beauty of a sunset? A few weeks ago, I heard Bach's Mass in B minor. How do you describe that with words? Lewis used another metaphor to try to explain what transposition is, a musical metaphor. He says, if you're making a piano version of a piece originally scored for an orchestra, then the same piano notes, which represent flutes in one passage, must also represent violins in another. The piano version means one thing to the musician who knows the original orchestral score, and another thing to the man who hears it simply as a piano piece. Then he says, but the second man would be at an even greater disadvantage if he'd never heard any instrument but a piano, and even doubted the existence of other instruments. Lewis is telling us there is a celestial orchestra playing, but all we have is a little piano. And it's not even a Steinway. All we have are a few notes to try to connect to those richer, to help us hear the echo of a tune we have not yet heard. News from a country we have never yet visited. Lewis, I believe, understood that process and used it. His review of Lord of the Rings is transpositional. He says, it's like lightning out of a clear sky. A metaphor to help us understand and communicate that. And I think visual metaphor is his primary technique. I have a hunch that Lewis was a visual learner. His ability to memorize and his acuity with images. In fact, he talks about this. He says, all 7 of my Narnia books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first, they were not a story, just pictures. Lewis knew how to convert those pictures to make them effable. And that's one of the reasons C.S. Lewis is C.S. Lewis, I suggest. Top book, Mere Christianity. I decided to go through one day and I read it and I tried to count all the metaphors. I'm not sure I got them all, but I counted 277. You might get a different number, and that might be something for you to do when next time you read Mere Christianity. I'm indebted to Michael Ward, who's cataloged some of those. Becoming a Christian is like, says Lewis, taking fuel on board, learning to walk, a drowning man clutching at a rescuer's hand, a tin soldier or statue coming alive, a horse turning into a Pegasus, coming in out of the wind, going home. Lewis knew how to share those ineffable experiences and connect us to it. Higher, richer, numinous, ineffable. C.S. Lewis was holistic. He was intentional. He was transpositional. The fourth principle is he was evocative. Effective communicators evoke emotion. In the courses I teach in communication, sometimes one of the key principles I talk about communication is this one. It's better to get a message out of someone than to put one in them. Every advertiser knows that. They want you to sing along with them. They want you to anticipate and participate in the commercial. Sometimes in communication we talk about creating meaning. Lewis wouldn't use that term. He talked about it in terms of discovering the truth or beauty that is already there, and he told us how to do that. He said, never use adjectives or adverbs which are mere appeals to the reader to feel as you want him to feel. He won't do it just because you ask him. You've got to make him. It's no good telling us a battle was exciting. If you succeed in exciting us, the adjective will be unnecessary. If you don't, it will be useless. Don't tell us the jewels had an emotional glitter. Make us feel the emotion. I can hardly tell you how important this is. Lewis said, evoke by surprising the reader or listener. Catch people unprepared. Do you think your readers or listeners will believe you just because you say so? You must go quite a different way to work, by direct description, by metaphor and simile, by secretly evoking powerful associations. Lewis talked about the value of rereading. He said a book wasn't really useful to him unless he reread it. I think one of the reasons we reread Narnia is because of how it makes us feel. He knew that. It wasn't about surprise. We don't read it because we forgot the plot. But Lewis talked about it in terms of surprisingness. If the opera La Boheme is being performed, I'll be there because I love it. Not because I wonder, in Act 3, will Mimi live this time? I don't think she will. But I watch it because of what it does to me. And Lewis knew that. His technique for doing that, tell a story. There are a variety of techniques. I'm just going to talk about one that he does, and that's the storytelling. The award-winning program 60 Minutes has been on the air since 1968, consistently in the top 10. Why is that? Don Hewitt said, the original producer, tell me a story. Tell me a story. And Lewis told us what stories were. He says, to be stories at all, there must be a series of events, but it must be understood that this series, the plot, as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. And that's what Lewis caught. That's what he evoked within us. I came across this book, because maybe some of you have read it too, 7 Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. Booker claims that of all the stories ever written, there are only 7 plots. Do you have a favorite story? Think about your favorite story. Come to mind, think of a story, and see if it's not couched in one of these plots. He said there are stories about the quest, voyage and return, overcoming the monster, rags to riches, rebirth is shadow into light, comedies are problems where there's a happy solution, tragedies start with a solution but end with a problem. I don't think there are 7 basic plots. What I learned from C.S. Lewis, I think there's only one plot to all stories that Lewis knew about. All stories are about finding home. The quest for what? Voyage and return where? Where do we go after we overcome the monster? What do we do after we have riches? Where do births happen and rebirths happen? Lewis knew that. And he tapped into that sense. Joseph Campbell, a hero with 1,000 faces, told us the same thing. A hero, he says, has a departure, an initiation, and a return home. Now, I don't mean that all stories end home. Some stories end tragically before you find home. Lewis would have agreed with what Dorothy Sayers wrote. What do all the great words come to in the end but that I love you, I'm at rest with you, I have come home. Conflict may be the stuff that makes drama, but it's conflict that keeps us from what? Finding home. Perhaps that's what T.S. Eliot meant when he said, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Lewis knew that. And so embedded in his work to get those messages out of us, a longing for our true home. I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy. The most probable explanation is I was made for another world. Again, his Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is probably his most popular book. It's on the list of the top 10 fiction books ever published. You've seen first edition copies of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's one over in the chapel. What I like about this particular copy, this is Pauline Bain's personal copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I didn't bring all 7, but there are people who love these stories because of what it gets out of us. And that's why we collect them, and that's why we want to reread them. Principle 5. Effective communicators are audience-centered. I'd been teaching public speaking for about 50 years, over 50 years. And write a book with my wife, Sue. We met on the college debate team. Those skills have come in useful in the 50 years of our marriage. And when I teach public speaking, the very first day of class, after I pass out the syllabus, I say, and now, students, I'm going to give you the answer to every question I'm going to ask this semester about public speaking. No matter what if you give me this answer, it's probably right. This is not going to be one of those classes where there's dead silence. Just give me this answer and it'll be the right answer. The answer to every question about public speaking is, and I pause for dramatic effect as they grab their pencils ready to write down this truth. The answer to every question about public speaking, I believe, is, it depends upon the audience. How long should a talk be? You have your answer. Should you start with a joke? You have your answer there too. Lewis knew that. He studied Aristotle and read, for of the three elements in speech-making, speaker, subject, and person addressed, it is the last one, the hearer, that determines the speech's end and object. So that's why he wrote. Instead of saying, how would Cicero have said that, you have to ask yourself, how would my scout or bedmaker have said that? Or this quote, it's absolutely disgraceful that we expect missionaries to the Bantus to learn Bantu, but never ask whether our missionaries to the Americans or English can speak American or English. Any fool can write learned language. The vernacular is the real test. What makes the test, he said, of any utterance, whether conversational or poetical, our first demand is that it must be interesting. I'm afraid we cannot make it more definite than that. Interesting to the audience. Lewis knew how to connect with us because of his life experiences of love and loss. We've already heard about the great love story between Joy and Jack. He experienced love and he experienced loss, and he was able to write about that and tell us about that. They started corresponding for a couple of years before they met in 1952. They hit it off, and yes, there are stories about Joy having a particular goal in mind and being intentional in her communication with C.S. Lewis. And Jack and Warren, he said, why don't you come spend Christmas with us in 1952? So she did. She spent Christmas at the Kilns, where many of you have been. The first gift that she gave to C.S. Lewis for Christmas, the first gift she gave him in this great love story, was a first edition copy of Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man. That's the very first gift that she gave him. Here it is. This is her inscription. And men grow weary of green wine and sick of crimson seas. Joy Davidman to C.S. Lewis, December 1952. What she wanted for Christmas, she said, Jack, would you inscribe my copy of The Great Divorce? That book, she said, was what helped lead me to faith and led her to Lewis. So would you, and Walter writes about this particular book and the inscriptions in this particular book. And so we know what the inscriptions are that Lewis wrote. I know what they are. Here's that book. This is Joy Davidman's copy of The Great Divorce, inscribed by C.S. Lewis. There are three images in my mind which I must continually forsake and replace by better ones: the false image of God, the false image of my neighbor, and the false image of myself, wrote C.S. Lewis. Satire is a glass in which the reader commonly sees every face except his own. C.S. Lewis knew his audience because he had experienced love and loss. My point today is we are here. We have spent our life studying Lewis because he connected with us, and he connected with many people. C.S. Lewis was a mere communicator, in the sense he was pure, essential, powerful, effective. The argument for that, he was popular. We're here and many other people are interested in C.S. Lewis. That's what he did for a living. But what I've wanted to convince you this morning is that Lewis was very interested in communication, not just as a practitioner, but giving us suggestions about language and human nature. And he did that by IT. Lewis himself was holistic, intentional, transpositional, evocative, and audience-centered. I want to conclude with one final application. And what I want to suggest is maybe these are not just Lewis's principles of communication. Maybe Lewis was tapping into something bigger than Lewis. Perhaps these are celestial principles of communication. God is holistic. God will use any means necessary to communicate with us. The embrace of a friend, a word written as scripture, a sunrise or a sunset, the heavens declare the glory of God. God is intentional. This is not random. There clearly is intelligence in why we were here and what happens to us. The law of the Lord is perfect in restoring the soul. God has a plan for us as we figure out we are the hero in our efforts that we are trying to find home. And God will get us there. Transposition may be the easiest one to suggest because Lewis even himself said it gives us a philosophy of the incarnation, from higher to lower, from richer to poorer, and he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. Transposition. God is evocative. In Kings we find, then he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, God uses a still small voice. God uses his Spirit to communicate and connect with us. And of course, God knows the number of hairs on our head. He knew us in the womb. He calls his own sheep by name. So perhaps Lewis was simply understanding and applying larger principles of how we connect. There are no ordinary people, said Lewis. The first time that appeared was in the journal Theology in November of 1941. This is the first time those words appeared in print. And the point I've made today is that C.S. Lewis was no ordinary communicator. How do we communicate like C.S. Lewis? What can you do to communicate like Lewis? Be holistic. Use conversational words to appeal to the head and the heart. Be intentional. Know where you're going. Think before you speak. Have a plan. Help us see, feel, and experience higher, richer vistas that Lewis saw and was able to connect us with those. Get messages out of us rather than just putting them in there. Those are the most powerful. That's how persuasion happens. And it's about connecting with others. Of course, we know that in the two great commandments to love God and others, our audience. C.S. Lewis was no ordinary communicator. It's why you are here today. That's my evidence, you. Thank you for being an extraordinary audience today. Thank you.
Lot of hands up. A lot of hands up. You can put them down. You will have a chance to ask Dr. Beebe questions over the next couple of days. Maybe you can tackle him on his way back home with his cargo. But of course, I could protect you and be your bouncer and bodyguard and help you pack. Let's give Dr. Beebe another round of applause.